The last technical issue that I want to explore for this project is setting up cameras and rendering out different kinds of images. So setting up cameras are fairly simple to establish. The basic concept with a camera is, at this point, I've been working exclusively from my perspective viewport. And as I'm modeling and navigating and setting up lights, I continue to change my view. So as I orbit around or pan or zoom, I constantly have a different view, which is fine when we're setting up our scene and we're modeling, but once we start making some significant design decisions and we want to capture a render, I could just take a snapshot of the perspective viewport and render this out. For the sake of posting my work in progress, I could take a screenshot of this when it's done and post that to the discussion board, and I'll review that process in just a second. But a slightly more appropriate way to do this is to start to introduce cameras. Now, let's say that this is a scene that I want to save, and you know, I want to be able to get back to this view. Well, if I'm in the perspective viewport and I continue to model and arrange things around, and I move and I'm jumping around my scene, good luck getting back to that perspective view, the one that we took the screenshot of. If we want to match it for some reason, we would have to estimate it. However, if we choose a view and we decide that, okay, this is a view that I really want to preserve, what we can do is we can introduce a camera into the equation. So I'm just going to go up to the command bar just to the left of the lights. I can click and hold, and you'll see there's a couple of different kinds of cameras. For the sake of this project, I only want to focus on a standard camera object. Now, when I introduce a camera, at first there's not a whole lot that happens. I see, you know, some information changes on my heads-up display, and I also see that I get a camera object inside my object manager. Well, if I pan out just a little bit, you can see that Cinema 4D created a camera object inside my scene. And like any other object I introduce inside my perspective viewport, I have this object now that I can reposition. And the advantage of this is, if I introduce a camera, so let's see, I panned out and I have a different composition, and if I introduce another camera, you'll notice that the camera that I introduce adopted the position that I'm looking through in my perspective viewport. Now, I'm not actually looking through the camera just yet, but if I just kind of continue to pull back, you can see that I now have two cameras in the scene, and whenever I introduce a camera, it's adapting adopting that perspective that I'm looking through. Now, if I actually want to look through the camera, what I can do, there's a couple of different ways to do this. I can go to the camera pull-down menu in the drop-down menu of the viewport, and I can choose Use Camera. Now, currently, we're looking through what Cinema 4D considers the default camera. I've been referring to that as our perspective viewport, but we can use an existing camera. Once I select that, you can see that I'm looking through camera. I'm looking through camera. Now, I could rename this camera. I'll just call this close camera, okay, because this camera was closer than the other. Camera 1 was the second camera that we introduced, and I'll call this bird's eye camera, okay? Now, as I mentioned, I can choose the camera pull-down menu, and I can choose to use different cameras, and if I want to go back to my default perspective view, I can do that. But there's a slightly quicker way, a much more intuitive way to switch between cameras. If I look in the object manager, way off to the right, you can see that there's this active camera icon. And currently they're both black, which means I'm not looking through either one of them. And if I click on one of those objects, you can see that it turns white, and now I am currently looking through the camera that I just activated. If I want to take a look through the close-up camera, I can just click on that icon, and now I'm looking through that camera. Now, you have to be careful when you introduce cameras because you might forget that you're looking through a camera. And right now, I'm looking through the close camera. I can tell because that bracket is turned white. And if I start to navigate like I have been in my perspective viewport, I'm actually moving the position of the camera. So I'm changing the perspective, okay? And maybe I'll zoom way out just to demonstrate this point. Now, if I want to go back to the perspective viewport, I can just toggle the active camera off by clicking on that same icon. And now you can see that I've moved my what was initially my close-up camera, I moved that way far away. So if I select my close cam, you can see that I've just moved that object way far away. So I could just kind of approximate the view that I want here by moving that camera object around. And Cinema 4D does a pretty good job of giving us a suggestion of what our camera is looking at. We have this this frame view here, so it gives us an approximation, and once we start getting the hang of cameras, we can get a pretty good idea of the camera arrangement, even when we're not looking through the camera. So again, I'll just take a look through my close-up cam. I'll zoom in and pan around, and so I'm actively moving the camera now. And the advantage of this, I'll deselect that active viewport, is that now I can always get back to that view. I can kind of think of that as kind of bookmarking my view or preserving my view. If I want to look at it again, I'll just jump back in. So now I feel like I'm ready to make a render of this scene and post it to the discussion board as a work in progress. And then, once I decide I'll capture a couple of different final renders, I'll post those to the discussion board as well. And then once I get my final renders, I'll also submit those as an assignment. Now, rendering the scene, we could just look through whatever camera we decide and I'll say render perspective viewport. So I can either Command R or I'll click on this left render icon, and I'll get this render in my perspective viewport. Now once that render is done, I could take a screenshot of this, and that's one way to capture the render, and it's a nice quick way to just grab a real quick render of a work in progress. And I can do that by holding down Command-Shift-3 on the keyboard, and you'll hear a little camera shutter icon, and now I'm confident that I have a screenshot on my desktop. I could also do Command-Shift-4, and once I do that, I get this little marquee that pops up, and I can click and drag and make a selection. Okay, so obviously I'm not going to capture. I'm going to capture whatever's inside this this marquee here, and I'm not capturing the actual perspective that I've rendered. Now, when I release the mouse, it takes a picture, and if I look out on my desktop, you'll see that I have a couple of different screens that have been captured, and I'll just preview those really quickly. Okay, so a couple different images, and I could rename these appropriately. So I'll just take this and I'll say, I'll call this Bill's Snowman WIP, or Work in Progress 01. And now I can post that to the discussion board. And I'll jump back into Cinema 4D here. That's one way to capture the image. Alternatively, and the most appropriate way to capture this image is to actually render this image out. And we can do that. There's the best way to do this is to go into the render settings. So I'm going to click on the render settings. We were there to turn on global illumination, and I'll start with the output tab. And from the output tab, I want to define the resolution that I'm going to render at. I'm going to let this for now default to 800 pixels wide by 600 pixels high, which is a fairly small, low resolution render. I'm going to let my resolution default, and everything else looks good. Now, if I wanted to go a little bit higher res, I could key in the value of the width and height that I want to capture, or I could choose one of these presets here by clicking on this drop-down menu. And I could choose a screen preset, and you can get a sense of what's there. If I want to render for a web or a web banner, I got some presets there. And then I also have some film and video renders. So maybe I'll just choose this NTSC widescreen, and when I do that, I get a 720 by 486. Now, that's a little bit smaller than even my default render, but for the sake of this demo, I think that that's going to be a pretty good size to render out and to post my works in progress so that other students can see what I'm doing as I'm working. Now, in addition to the output tab, I'll go down to the save tab, and this is a very important tab. This is the place where we can determine the file path that we're saving to, and we can determine the format of the file that we're rendering. Now, the best practice here is to identify the file field and go way over here and click on the ellipsis. And I'm going to render this to my Snowman project folder. So I'm just going to jump out here. I'm going to go into my class folder, into my Snowman folder, and you'll see that I've created a renders folder already, because I don't want these renders to run free in my project folder. I want to keep them organized. So on the fly, we could create a new folder, call it renders. I've already created that folder, so I'll just back off from there and I'll select the renders folder as the destination. I'll also choose the file name that I'm going to save this as. So there's a save as field here, and I'll just call this Bill W _ snowman. This is still a work in progress, so I'll include WIP 01. Okay, so it's got my name, it's got my project, a little notation that it's a work in progress, and the version. So this will be my first render, and I'll save that. And once I do, in the file field, we can quickly audit this, and I can see that it's saving to my desktop, into my class folder, into my project folder, into a renders folder. So I'm very satisfied, and I know exactly where that file is going. I can then choose the format, and currently by default it's set to TIFF, and I don't really want to render to a TIFF. For this class, whenever we're posting this content to a discussion board or submitting it as an assignment, I always want to save it as a JPEG unless I have a compelling reason to choose another file format. In later projects we'll talk about different appropriate file formats, so I'll just choose JPEG for now. I'll leave the bit depth at 8 for now. Everything else looks good. So at this point I've covered my output tab, my save tab, and everything else I'm just gonna overlook at this point, and I'll close the render settings dialog box. Now, one thing to note is that if I've saved my project file, so I'll just give this a quick save. It seems like an appropriate time to save this. If I open up my render settings and I make a change here, so if I go to output and I choose a different preset, and I'll just change film and video to one of these 720. I'll just do this this HD 720. There it is, HD 720. And once I do that, I get a higher resolution render. Once I close that, you'll notice that that is a project property that when I save my Cinema 4D project, the next time I open it, when I go to render settings, all of these settings will be preserved. So just note that when I change these render settings, I'm actually changing my file. So I'll change this back to NTSC widescreen. It's a nice, fairly small render. I'll close my render settings. Now remember, I've established my output and my save as locations. The next thing I'll do is I'll simply just click on this render button. If I click on the render button, you can see that the tooltip that pops up says render to picture viewer, or the shortcut is Shift R, or I can click and hold on this and render to picture viewer. Okay, so if I just click on that icon one time, that brings up our picture viewer, and you'll see the active render that Cinema 4D is rendering. We'll take a closer look at this window in our next project, but for now, you'll see that I got the render. I got to render my view. I can confirm that this file was saved out. I'll just jump out into my project folder, into Snowman, into renders, and there you can see the file that I just generated. I'll select that file, I get the preview, and now I'll just jump back into the discussion board. I'll jump into my Snowman project, and from here I'll create a new thread and just say Bill's Snowman work in progress, and I'll start to post these as I'll either attach or I'll embed the image into my post. And at that point, other students can see what you're doing. So have fun with this project, experiment with it. I'm going to continue to work on my project and really kind of consider the environment, the background. I'll probably take another pass at lighting. Of course, I'll add some details to my snowman, and some of the basic details that I want to add. Obviously, I want to throw some kind of mouth into the equation. I'll probably throw some buttons on the front of my snowman. I'll add some detail to the hat, just like a simple band. And I'll also kind of move some stuff around. For example, I really don't like the way that my hat is sitting. It's sitting just kind of perfectly on top of my snowman, and so I'm going to kind of rough this up a little bit by rotating the hat around, and I'll just kind of tip it to one side or the other and position it in a way that seems a little bit more appropriate, something that's a little less perfect. So one of the glitches of working in 3D is that you can be so precise about things that things really look unnatural. Even if I have a stylized scene like this, I want to give it some character by, kind of moving some things around. So have fun with this project. Make sure that you're posting works in progress to the discussion board. That is a project requirement. And then also you'll notice that inside the lessons folder there will be an assignment submission. As the due date starts to approach, there'll be an assignment submission, and you need to attach appropriate renders to that assignment as well. So have fun with the project. If you have any other questions, post them to the discussion board, and I'll continue to make some really quick video tutorials that talk about tips and tricks for the workflow for this snowman project. But for now, I think you have all that you need to know to come up with an effective snowman scene and start to post your works in progress in the discussion board. So we'll catch up a little bit later online. Have fun with this project.